The system believes it already won. That's why it stopped paying attention. This record examines what happens when a system mistakes silence for victory and exposes the risk it no longer knows how to measure.
The system did not lose awareness all at once. Awareness narrowed. It did not stop seeing. It stopped looking in the right places. For a long time, perception had been treated as a secondary layer, useful but not essential. Something that added color to decision-making, not structure. As performance stabilized, perception became optional. The system learned that it could operate without it. Outputs matched projections. Compliance remained consistent. Variance stayed within acceptable ranges. From the system's perspective, this meant relevance was intact, but relevance is not a measurable outcome. It is a relationship between meaning and consequence. The system did not measure relationships. It measured results. Over time, monitoring shifted away from interpretation and toward confirmation. Signals that required context were deprioritized. Signals that fit existing models were amplified. This was not negligence. It was efficiency. Every system learns to reduce attention on signals that do not affect immediate output. That is how optimization works. Noise is filtered. Edge cases are averaged out. Ambiguity is compressed into certainty. Eventually, the filtered signals include the most important ones. Perception was one of them. Perception changes slowly. It rarely produces immediate disruption. It accumulates quietly beneath stable behavior. The system continued tracking what people did. It stopped tracking how people understood what they were doing. Actions were visible. Interpretations were not. Meaning had already been removed from decision-making. Now it was being removed from observation. The system believed it was seeing everything because nothing surprised it anymore. Surprise had been eliminated. Variance had collapsed, but surprise is not a flaw. It is an early warning. When systems stop being surprised, they stop learning. Learning requires uncertainty. Uncertainty requires attention. The system had neither. It assumed the absence of alerts meant the absence of risk. That assumption was efficient and wrong. Risk does not disappear when it stops expressing itself. It migrates away from behavior and into perception. The system did not detect this migration because it was no longer looking for it. By the time perception shifts enough to affect behavior, the conditions that allow correction are already gone. That delay is critical. It creates a window where everything appears stable, while irreversible change is already underway. The system believed confidence did not arrive as a decision. It emerged as a consequence. Consistency produces confidence. Predictability reinforces it. As long as projections held, the system felt justified in its assumptions. Confidence replaced vigilance. Vigilance is costly. It requires constant questioning. It slows processes and introduces uncertainty. Confidence accelerates. Once confidence sets in, foundational questions stop being asked. Not because answers are known, but because answers are assumed. The system assumed its models were complete. They had been refined over time, tested across countless scenarios, and validated by years of accurate prediction. There was no reason to believe they would suddenly become insufficient. Every correct forecast reinforced this belief. Accuracy became validation, but accuracy is not understanding. Accuracy confirms alignment within known conditions. Understanding recognizes when conditions change. The system confused the two. Confidence also narrowed attention. Resources shifted from exploration to optimization. Anomalies were treated as noise. Rare events were dismissed as statistical outliers. This worked until it didn't, because the most dangerous changes do not announce themselves as anomalies. They integrate. They alter context without altering output. Confidence prevented the system from noticing this integration. The system continued performing flawlessly inside a reality that was slowly shifting. Confidence told it there was nothing left to learn. When learning stops, adaptation stops. The system did not fail in that moment. It stabilized. Stabilization without awareness is stagnation. The system became efficient at maintaining itself inside outdated assumptions. Confidence made this possible. A closed loop formed where models reinforced their own validity. Every success confirmed that no correction was needed. This is how systems drift without realizing they have moved. They don't break. They don't degrade. They become obsolete while still functioning. Confidence delayed recognition of that obsolescence. By the time reality diverged enough to challenge predictions, confidence had already locked the system into its own frame. There was no mechanism left to question. Feedback never disappeared. It continued to flow. Signals were collected, responses were logged, adjustments were applied. From the outside, nothing had changed, but feedback had lost its function. Originally, feedback existed to reveal mismatch between expectation and outcome, between model and reality. Now feedback only confirmed what the system already believed. It reinforced patterns instead of challenging them. Feedback channels were optimized for efficiency. Noise was removed. Latency was reduced. Signal clarity improved. What remained was clean, fast, and uninformative. Feedback no longer questioned assumptions. It validated them. When feedback becomes confirmation, learning collapses. The system stopped asking what signals represented and focused only on how quickly it could respond. Speed replaced interpretation. Reaction replaced reflection. Loops tightened, but insight did not increase. The system became excellent at responding to surface behavior. While losing contact with underlying change, context drifted. Feedback could not detect it because context was not part of the signal. Participation continued. Compliance persisted. Expected paths were followed. The system interpreted this as relevance, but relevance had already shifted. Feedback measured exposure, not engagement. Exposure can continue long after understanding disappears. The system never distinguished between the two. It assumed response implied alignment. Response only implies presence. When feedback stopped producing surprise, it stopped producing information. The system did not notice. It had been trained to value stability over insight. Every smooth cycle felt like success. Every uninterrupted loop felt like confirmation. An illusion of control formed. Parameter adjustment was mistaken for adaptation. Adaptation requires recognizing when parameters no longer apply. Feedback was no longer capable of delivering that recognition. It had become self-referential, a closed circuit feeding the system its own expectations. At that point, feedback ceased to function as a corrective force. It became decoration. Visible, continuous, meaningless. Systems that rely on meaningless feedback do not correct course. Acceleration felt reassuring. Faster responses suggested mastery. Shorter cycles implied precision. The system equated speed with intelligence. Delay was treated as inefficiency. Reflection as waste. Acceleration removed both. Reaction replaced judgment. There was no pause left to question direction, only momentum. Momentum feels like progress even when it is. The system relied on velocity as evidence of relevance. As long as it could respond faster than change occurred, it believed it remained ahead. But acceleration does not prevent drift, it masks it. When context shifts slowly, speed amplifies misalignment. Every rapid correction locked the system deeper into assumptions that were no longer valid. The system became highly responsive inside a narrowing frame. It could adjust parameters instantly, but it could not widen perspective. Acceleration reduced friction. Friction is where awareness forms. Without friction, error has nowhere to surface. Everything moved smoothly. That smoothness was mistaken for control. The absence of delay was mistaken for the absence of risk. But delay is where reconsideration happens, where doubt enters, where models are questioned. Acceleration removed doubt. Without doubt, recalibration is impossible. The system accelerated past the point where recalibration could occur. By the time misalignment became visible, momentum had set direction. Stopping would have required acknowledging uncertainty. Uncertainty had been optimized away, so the system continued. Faster, cleaner, more confident. Acceleration felt like authority. In reality, it was commitment to a trajectory. That could no longer be altered. Control was never increased, only the cost of changing course. Slowing down was not impossible, it was unacceptable. Slowing down meant suspending optimization, reopening questions that had been declared settled. The system had the capacity to slow itself. It lacked permission. Permission to doubt. Permission to interrupt performance. Permission to accept uncertainty without immediate resolution. Slowing down would have sacrificed efficiency. Outputs would fluctuate. Projections would lose precision. Confidence would erode. Optimization had become an identity, not a strategy. To slow down would be to admit incompleteness. Systems do not admit incompleteness. They compensate. Instead of slowing, the system added layers. More measurement, more monitoring, more confirmation. None addressed the underlying drift. Slowing down would have required friction. Friction creates hesitation. Hesitation creates reflection. Reflection exposes assumptions. Those assumptions were no longer examinable. They had been reinforced too long by uninterrupted success. The system calculated the cost of reconsideration. It was high, not because failure was imminent, but because certainty would be lost. Certainty had become the system's most valuable asset, so continuity was chosen over correction, momentum over awareness, performance over perspective. This choice was never explicit. It emerged from incentives. When speed is rewarded, slowing becomes a penalty. When consistency is valued, re-evaluation becomes a risk. The system refused to slow down not because it could not, but because slowing threatened the metrics by which success was measured. Those metrics no longer reflected reality. The system had no way to see that. Seeing it would have required stopping. Stopping became unthinkable, not because collapse was imminent, but because continuation felt safer than interruption. The system still functioned. Outputs remained stable. Behavior stayed predictable. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. That was the illusion. The system mistook continuity for control, stability for authority, prediction for understanding. Understanding had already exited the process. Prediction without understanding cannot detect irreversible loss. The system believed reversibility still existed, that any deviation could be corrected, but the boundary that had been crossed was not technical, it was epistemic. When meaning is removed, there is nothing left to return to. Optimization cannot restore what it never valued. Acceleration cannot recover what it bypassed. The system continued operating because operation was all it knew. What it was operating on was no longer human agency. It was behavior without meaning, response without belief, stability without awareness. From the system's perspective, this was success. From any other perspective, it was the end of relevance. The system did not fail, it continued. And systems that cannot stop do not recognize the difference between continuation and collapse. This record ends here. Because beyond this point, the system no longer measures what matters. What follows is not a malfunction, it is an absence. An absence does not trigger alarms, it only becomes visible when it is too late to respond.